Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. In today's episode, Dr. Joan Palmiter Bajorek, a researcher and linguist, talks about the power of conversational design. Joan explores how conversational designers work, her approach to voice design projects, why key performance indicators matter, and the challenges voice designers face. Enjoy the episode.
Hi, Joan. Welcome to The Future is Spoken.
Thanks for having me on.
That's great. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, before we jump into the power of conversation design, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what you're doing at the moment?
Sure. So my name is Joan. I primarily identify as a linguist and a researcher. I have a master's in linguistics and a PhD in the field of speech-language technology. I've previously worked at Nuance and Versa, and I'm the CEO and founder of Women in Voice, which is the international nonprofit for women and gender minorities in voice tech. So I work across the spectrum of the design part, the linguistic and technical parts, and also the strategy across the voice ecosystem.
So the whole spectrum, really.
There is little that I don't touch, but I mean, understanding everyone's role, I think, is really important. But I think as you grow in your career, I don't know. I knew I probably, as my PhD advisor said, I wasn't always going to be in the trenches. That chances are I'd be moving up to more of a strategic position and kind of managing teams overall.
Was that your goal when you began your career, that you kind of quickly realized that you wanted to work in something strategic?
Not necessarily. I think I have, when I was working in high school, people would tease me that I'm destined to be a CEO. I think leadership positions, and I've founded multiple things. So I think just kind of seeing a broader picture or kind of above the scenes has been a common thread across my work.
Right. You've had a fascinating career, and I'd like to know if when you began your academic career, if you saw yourself moving into a strategic leadership role at that time when you were younger and you began a BA in Fine Arts at the University of Washington. Then you moved on to complete a Master of Arts in Linguistics. And then finally at the University of Arizona, a PhD in Linguistics, speech-language technology, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So what were your plans then, or did your academic career influence where you are now, or did you have a very clear picture of where you wanted to be?
It's a good question. I feel like I'm one of those people that knows that there's a beacon on the horizon and just keeps walking there. And other people see it as a very winding path, but for me, it feels very linear. In my undergraduate degrees, which are, as you mentioned, in fine arts, kind of photography, graphic design, as well as French and linguistics. I think it's really interesting that people are like, oh, you got undergraduate degrees in that? Like, really fascinating. But for me, with the literature work, reading and writing and be able to articulate yourself with words, and then with my photography degree, primarily being able to translate what's in your head onto the wall is a skill, and really ideating and translating what is in your head onto the wall and how that is communicated to other people, kind of these visual and word modalities really continue to influence my work today. So yes, that's what kind of drove at the beginning. That feels like so long ago, how many life chapters ago, but that was a lot of my starting off academic work.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so true about language. Sorry, just to interject
Please.
That, if people think, oh, why would you go and study anything around language or writing or linguistics? But the thing is, if you learn to think as you do when you write, you create a framework for understanding the world. That's kind of my understanding.
Absolutely. And I think it's also...
And it helps you understand ideas and things like that.
It's definitely also how we're socialized. I mean, I think especially as someone who's really interested about the world, about cultures, like the language is always called to me. Although in my PhD program, my friend joked that linguistics is a gateway drug for women to get into computer science. Because if you told me as a young kid that I was going to be, coding in R, using lots of different data sets, I'd be like, yeah, that doesn't sound interesting. But kind of how you think about the world, and when you are working on my PhD, there was no question that I would need some coding to do the type of work that I wanted to do.
Okay.
So, I think you figure out the questions you want to pursue and you make it happen.
So you finished your PhD fairly recently. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you studied and how it impacted or even changed your thinking and your approach to life?
Sure. Well, I think I probably would start with my master's, which kind of builds into my PhD. My master's started in French linguistics, but when you're taking all the coursework in linguistics, right, syntax, morphology, phonetics, etc., I started studying Duolingo's interfaces, which are pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, I was like, wait a minute, this is like, translation, like multilingual, like a multimodal speech interface, like designed by 3 people
Mm-hmm.
for the world. Talk about like high impact products. And I was just really thinking of where are they setting the thresholds for like what is acceptable when you speak into the system. And so from that research, did a lot of research on ed tech, kind of gamification, thinking about different inputs and outputs. And that's when I went to my PhD program, proposing that and saying there's this whole field that is definitely understudied. I'm an ideal candidate to study it. And from there, I found a phenomenal advisor, partnered with multiple startups. And that was my PhD project, was to partner with a startup. They donated over $10,000 worth of software to my project to do research to see it was a pre-test, post-test. So I got lots and lots of participants, collaborated with the French program at University of Arizona, had people try out this VR experience that has a voice input. So there's a speech component, there's a visual component, and really looking at, honestly, the future of our interfaces and how people responded. So you can write that up a lot of different ways. There's kind of an acoustic piece of the puzzle and kind of automatic speech recognition, linguistic component, kind of a human-computer interaction piece of the puzzle, embodied cognition. People felt like they were there, speaking in these contexts.
Wow.
So that's the type of research that I start presenting at academic conferences and then tech conferences. And when I hit tech conferences, that's when my career just really blew up. I spoke at Voice Summit 2018, and then got a job at Nuance after that.
Wow. And what was the startup that you worked with when you were completing your PhD?
Yeah, it's called Immerse Me. It's an ed tech company out of New Zealand.
Okay, fascinating.
Yeah.
And now you've so kind of moving on to today, you were founder and you're the CEO of Women in Voice. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, and a lot of people haven't heard of Women in Voice. Can you tell us about Women in Voice and its purpose and what it's doing at the moment?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, Women in Voice is kind of like the women who code for voice tech. So it's about, amplifying, empowering women and gender diversity in voice tech. We do a lot of different things, but primarily we have 15 chapters in 9 countries around the world.
Well, that's pretty good.
And we're just about 2 years old. We just celebrated our 2-year anniversary.
That's amazing, for something so young.
It is super young. And I think we're currently working on 501c3 US nonprofit paperwork, which is almost done. But really, when we think about 2 years versus 5 years, sustainability is what I daydream about all the time. But that actually came about right. So I was finishing my PhD 2018, and I presented at Voice Summit. And that's when what I usually talk about is from the academic sphere of languages and linguistics and women and men killing it in their research field, and then coming with the same exact research to tech and big tech conferences, and just who was in the room, who was on the stage, the whole environment felt like a slap in the face. And at the time I was on the job market, hustling, and just realizing like I was going to join this field. Like I was very confident that I would be getting a job in this field. And just like I'm not complicit in normalizing this behavior. And so like, what am I going to do? And I went home and I was just like, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I launched Women in Voice a month later.
Wow.
Yeah. And put out a Google form to the internet and asked for leadership to help me. And 27 people signed up.
Which is pretty good. Yeah.
I mean, I thought a few of my friends would just sign up. I was like, can we get 6? But I think just like that many people responding, I was like, ooh, I'm not the only one who is looking for more or interested in making change. And since then, we've scaled it many times. I mean, I think over 50 people report to me these days. And just like the impact we are seeing in our field is really, really powerful. So
you took kind of a quite demoralizing and disheartening experience and really turned it around into something positive.
Well, I didn't plan to make Women in Voice. I think a lot of people think I have like strange world domination intentions, and that's not the case. I was like, I can't sleep at night if this is going to be the case. Like people are not confident or like they don't feel like they belong. It seemed wildly inaccurate to me since I'd been in this other world that, I mean, academia is not perfect, don't get me wrong. But it was a radically different way that we respect people with different backgrounds. Yeah.
And in addition to Women in Voice, you are quite busy. I was going to say quite busy. I think the word is really busy. You're as you mentioned earlier, a professional speaker, and you've got a couple of other positions that you're busy with. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah. So after Nuance, I worked at Versa as their head of conversational research. Versa's an agency working on that. I do a lot of different consulting for startups these days. There's a lot of technical work on that side. I can't tell you about all the projects I'm working on, but I am really, really busy. I think I did not know that I was going to be, as with the Women in Voice, wasn't planning to make that passion project that took on a life of its own. My public speaking has also, and just I publish, I speak. I think the public speaking, it's you feel like a little peon in grad school, just like grinding away, doing work like no one sees. And then suddenly, I'm, earlier this year was on the stage at CES. So it feels, it's been a transition, but a really meaningful one. I think what I remind myself when I'm like, oh, another speaking thing is how people find us. And when people come to Women in Voice and they say, whoa, I'm ready, let's hit the ground running. And I say, like, how did you find us? And they're like, I saw you on this blog, or I heard about you on this podcast, and I was like, I had to join. And that's, I honestly, a question I get often is like, how did you get these ambassadors? Like these women, work at the top tech companies in the world. Like, how did you get them in Women in Voice? And I was like, actually, I'm going to reframe it for you. They bang down my door asking how they can sign up and how they can be a part of this. Because if you have experienced any of this, you know how much better we can do in this field, in all fields, but especially our own field and tech and society. And so it really resonates with women and men. We have so many allies who support us in many, many ways.
That's great.
Yeah.
So the public speaking is incredibly effective in raising one's profile, isn't it? And as you've noted, making the right kind of connections with people who think differently, who think the same as you, but you share the same values and you want to accomplish the same things or some of the same things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes people forget that I have a technical background. And so sometimes I'm in very, very posh rooms and people say things and I like make a joke and they're like, oh, wait a minute, she does have, or like having that R&D experience, I think gratefully helps out Women in Voice quite a bit. But I will always be the founder. I will not always be the CEO. So we will make sure, no matter who holds this title, that they can represent the field well.
And let's move to what we want to talk about today, Joan, and that's the power of conversation design. And, before we jump in, could you give us a definition of conversation design?
Absolutely. Yes. Conversational design. Where do we even start? Usually when I'm talking to people who don't know anything about our field, what I usually say is, have you interacted with Alexa or Siri products? And most of them say, yeah, I've heard about it. I have one. My friend has one. And I say, this is a customer facing product to a whole ecosystem of tech that we think about as voice tech, conversational design, bots, whatever you want to call this ecosystem. And so when we think about what a conversational designer is, it's someone who is in some way designing the user experience. So an example I often use is in magazines when they're like, find out your dream chocolate or whatever it is. What is your birth month? Is it December? Yes or no, right? All these different decision trees, and we've seen these.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversation designer is the person who is usually writing those yes nos. They're writing the script and the different things, but also just how that whole flow goes. So designing the conversation. And often enough, the person or the user only experiences one path in the overall architecture, but the conversation designer has to design it from top to bottom, or less top down is usually how we design. It can be a situational design, but that is so the person who's doing that is called the conversational designer, or the VUI, voice user interface designer.
Okay. So is it true to say that conversational design and voice user interface are interchangeable?
I use them interchangeably. I mean, there's a lot of, especially even in job ads, you see a lot of people mixing up these words and what they actually mean, who they actually want with which skill set does vary. But conversational designer, voice user interface designer, I use them interchangeably.
Okay. And that often happens, doesn't it, when a field or an area is relatively new? I can remember when people first started using the internet and we saw all different terms for new media manager, that kind of thing, until we figured out what we were doing and what we wanted to call things and what was accurate and appropriate.
Totally.
And conversational designer, I mean, the way you described it sounds simple, but it's not. It must be incredibly complex because, as you said, when a one individual encounters it and selects certain pathways on that tree of decisions, they're just going along one route. But for the person who's designing it, they have to think of every possible scenario, I would imagine. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are many different ways to design it, but the traditional way is that you would write a happy path, or like the perfect thing that gets the user from what they're they arrive at the system to their destination, a transaction, whatever it might be, a happy path, a golden path. But really what usually happens is that they go all around the path to different things. And so writing error responses, rerouting the user, I'm trying to write the architecture out for you. You can find bubble charts and things. But the conversation designer has to do the whole system, wherever it goes. So larger, huge architectures. I mean, I've seen backends for large telecom that is just a huge constellation of different inputs and outputs. So I think this also, a lot of people confuse kind of conversational designer with conversational development, and who is coding the variables for how the code looks in the back end. And a lot of conversational designers frequently have more creative backgrounds, and conversational developers, have more coding backgrounds. But this is very, very blurred. I mean, when I've worked on different systems, I've definitely been coding Booleans and other things. So, you can certainly come from any part of the field, but you may have to learn coding depending on how the team functions.
Okay. So for something that might not have many different decision points or different pathways, an individual could do that. For example, you might be working for an insurance company that sells just one product, and you might have the yes, no, or I'm not sure answers. So that's what you might call a relatively simple project.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think there's many different goals. When I worked at Versa as an agency, designing custom solutions and really thinking about the goals for the end user of, if they're contacting, I think you said insurance.
Yeah, just as an example. Yeah.
They're contacting insurance, they want an answer to their question. But the insurance company has its own goals, right? It might want to, cut down costs. It might try to retain the user. It might try to upsell the user to buy other products, or get them off the phone as soon as possible, because customer support is super expensive. So making sure they spend as much time on the phone or with the bot or with a voice interaction, all of those things factor into how it's designed usually.
And for something that's much more complex, and possibly for a larger organization or an organization that has more than one product or different facets to a product, that kind of conversational design is going to be by its very nature more complex, isn't it? Is that the kind of thing one person can do, or are you looking at having a team on that kind of project?
You mean like a team of conversational designers?
Yeah, if they're working, for like a really big organization.
Yes, it's very common too.
Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't also mention kind of the legal and authentication that has to happen as well, right? If people have to, say part of their social security number or different passwords and things. So there may be a lot of different parts of who is working on which parts of the system, for example.
Right. And I suppose that kind of legal and authentication would happen depending on which part of the world you're in, which state for America, which province or region of the UK or state in Australia. Yeah, so they're very, very depending on where you are globally. Yeah. Now, what kind of skills does a conversational designer bring to the job? We're thinking about our audience here. They're coming to the Digital Assistant Academy. They're going to be studying voice interaction design. They'll be learning about conversational design. What should they be thinking of, or what kind of skill set should they have?
It's a good question. I strongly believe anyone can come to this field. I don't think that there's any, you studied neurobiology, we don't want you. Anyone can come to this field. I think coming from a language or linguistics background is helpful, just because you've been thinking about reading texts and writing, especially, my friend Rebecca Evanho and I laugh about different things because she comes from such a creative writing background, and I come from a linguistic. This is tagging it as a noun. This is a type of noun. All these different more different formulas of thinking about words. So we all come to that with different ways, but I think anyone who can write, who can think about conversational flows, writing out a flow, reading it out loud, and seeing how it sounds. I think just, a lot of people ask me, like, where do I start? How do I start? And you start by just designing one, even if it's a fake one. The most famous one, almost everyone starts with like a pizza ordering app.
Okay.
Something like this. I don't know if I recommend pizzas, but as you mentioned with insurance, or is it booking a flight or whatnot, but just really starting small and building it out and seeing how complicated they can get and the type of questions you're asking yourself.
Well, it's so funny that you mentioned pizza, because I tried to order a pizza online the other week, and it was incredibly complex. All the crusts, different toppings. One group wanted a certain sauce, the other group wanted a different sauce. I ended up phoning them. I just gave up. So, I can imagine for something like pizza, designing a conversational tree or design for that, even if the answers are yes or no, that's going to be really complex.
Right. And if the automatic speech recognition doesn't get you, I always use the example of, what if I asked for peppers and it gave me pepperoni instead?
Yeah.
Right? Like how many different error recoveries one might have to do if you're ordering 10 toppings, and then the sauces and crusts. And that's what for the future of this field, I believe that the future is going to be multimodal. Like, wouldn't it be savvy if you said, I want to order a pizza, and on your device, it gives you some options. You click on the toppings you want and you go to the next thing, right? Like there's some aspects where visuals are helpful. And traditionally conversational designers are only thinking about the words, kind of the spoken input and output exclusively. the future will not look like that. The future will be way more integrated and have lots of different types of inputs and outputs.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, when one approaches conversational design, let's say it's a fairly simple product, maybe insurance, hopefully not pizza as your first client. Where's the start point, Joan? What do you do? Do you sit down with the client? Do you research the product? Do you look into the brand persona? How does one start with this?
Yeah, this is a great question. What I usually like to do, and a lot of people have different strategies and approaches, is I like to do an alignment meeting and say, like, have everyone sit down in a room, or well, not today, but everyone get together and say, what are the goals of this? If we make the perfect solution for you, or we have the perfect design, what does that look like? And you kind of hand the mic to different people in the room. And one person might say, I want the most efficient system possible. Like, speed to finishing the interaction is key. And another person might say, I want them to buy as many products as possible. Or another one might say, the brand. I want them to know that they spoke with our brand when they were interacting with the system, right? And that kind of awareness. There's so many different factors. And so I think defining success, defining your KPIs initially across functionally is extremely important. Because when you're designing a system, you go, ooh, I'm making this choice versus this choice versus this choice. And I can't contact the person every time I have a micro question. And really thinking, okay, back at our initial strategy meeting, we said that this was fundamental. And I think that's where I would start. And as you mentioned, there's, brand persona, there's writing different scripts, there's thinking about the different words of products that you might need to use. There's lots of different strategies, but that's where I would start from the very beginning.
And what a great approach as well, an alignment meeting. I've never heard that term before, but making sure that everybody is on the same page, and somebody has to kind of, from the client point of view, someone has to be the leader and make final decisions about, what is the ultimate goal. One person might want sales. Someone else might want to track web traffic, whatever meaning, but there has to be the key, as you said, the KPIs, key performance indicators for the client, so that the conversational designer knows what goals they're working towards in developing this conversation, what the outcomes should be.
Absolutely. And I think defining KPIs is underrated, or people, they get fuzzy really fast sometimes. I call myself a data wrangler because I'm like, okay, we are looking for this. How do we measure it? What numbers are we gathering? If it's, analytics or whatnot, what numbers matter? Are we sure we're going to be collecting them, analyzing them, getting an actionable report? Like all the different pieces of it. I think that comes from my academic backgrounds of like writing methods reports again and again and again. But I think really, especially with these big dollar signs, I mean, I've worked for clients where, if I can optimize their system and like cut down 10, 15% of their costs, we're talking about like numbers of Teslas that I could be saving in. This is not small beans usually for these clients. So measuring what that success could look like is key.
Those two specific things that you mentioned there, the cost and the measuring, are they things that would specifically fall under the remit of the conversational designer, or are those more part of the big picture?
I think that's part of the big picture. I think having worked on some of these systems, it's a little bit weird to, as I mentioned, with upselling or constantly forcing people down certain user flows. I've seen a really kind of, or it's difficult as an end user to be like, oh, this is why my interactions at CVS are so terrible, because there are decision makers who are deciding, that I'm going to be given ads one after another. I think people would be surprised how many seemingly micro choices for the end user. Oh, this is glitchy. Maybe it was actually designed to be glitchy for you. Are artifacts of people's choices.
And now going back to where we were, we've had the alignment meeting. We've got everybody on side. Everyone is reading from the same page, so to speak. We're agreeing on the outcomes and the goals. What does the conversational designer do next?
start building.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So whether
Can you describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So let's use that insurance example.
Mm-hmm.
One of the aligning, knowing what you're building, starting to write some user flows. It's very common for people to write 5 to 10 or more examples of the system talking to the user back and forth about specific things. So the user is going to come and ask us about why their premium increased recently, or they want to track a transaction with the insurance company. I don't know, lots of these different things. But the company should know what people are coming to talk to them about. So having lots of, let's say we make 10 user flow conversation examples. And then I would probably check them across the whole team. Maybe we would read them out loud. Maybe we would check them with the client or with legal. We might check them with our coding, development, engineering team we're not trying to design something that can't be built is actually a real problem. And so once you build that out, building the architectures, it's very, very common to build the scripts or like the words themselves in Excel. I've seen so many times this happen. But often you'll use a voice flow or lucid chart to visualize, as I mentioned, the architecture of where people might go in the overall flow.
Right. And is the conversational designer always the one that might build as well as kind of developing and testing and reading out the conversations, or does the next stage of the coding and the physical development, does that move on elsewhere?
That depends on literally every team. I've seen, even within a company, different teams function differently. It may be that the designer, mocks something up and then sends it to development and then later gets it back. I've seen way more agile approaches where the developer is in the room and saying, yes, no, ooh, I need clarification on this. And strategy might be in the room. A project manager may have promised something that's almost impossible to deliver on time. Our speech sciences team may have different things to say about it. It really, really depends.
I see. Okay. So it's very much going to depend on the type of organization that you're working for and the group or the team that's put together to develop the conversation, really. Absolutely. The scenarios for people who complete the voice interaction design course, the scenarios could be very different. In fact, I'm sure some of the students will want to even set up their own agency and go their own way and work on finding new solutions for businesses and organizations out there.
Absolutely, because if we think about the other way, if we're thinking about the company, and I talk to a lot of companies who are like, oh my, voice is coming, I need a strategy. And they're usually doing one of two things. They're either hiring, so there's the kind of, they are potentially hiring people to have an internal team. They might be contacting an agency and paying an agency to do work for them. Or another one, it's not as common, but they upskill people. So they say, oh, internally we have a new project, and they actually are paying for conversational designers to take courses. I've seen this in different companies, but especially at bigger enterprise companies, they usually want to own the project internally. But people also are hiring agencies to do parts of the work or test different pieces of the puzzle. So I think from the company, if we're talking about from the insurance company's perspective, right, they may have their own goals of why they're hiring this team. And that influences how the conversational designer will be building things out.
That's really interesting, and it's fascinating that there are so many different scenarios that people could encounter. And I suppose that's the same with every kind of career that you might enter into.
Well, I think that's also, I think you see the differences in the quality or the approach in different systems. You could write it so many different ways. I think we've all interacted with, as you mentioned, phone systems that are terrible. But there's also different systems where I'm like, that was so easy. Gosh, okay. Or like I had a banking problem a few years ago, and I remember hearing the flow and just being like, whoa, who wrote this? Like, this is beautiful. This is so good. I want to give them a 10-star rating. Like, congratulations. This was a very seamless, frictionless user experience. So I think the end user feels the difference in those tweaks, in those changes that are made throughout the process.
And that's so important, isn't it? Because that ultimately is going to affect the brand reputation.
And this is what I think people don't often realize. My friend at Inuit, He's talked about, he's no longer at Inuit. He's now at Apple, but he's talked about kind of the angry customers and how your overall brand will be responded to, and really thinking about retention of users, that a lot of people pay for the minimum viable product, but once they've paid huge amounts of money to get that developed, suddenly they realize that user experience is important and how they'll retain customers potentially. And suddenly they pay way more money, and sometimes even have to rebuild the whole system because the minimum product was not good enough. But he talks about bringing in angry users, bring in the users who will tell you the very blunt truth about your system and then change it. Really listen to them. So user experience work, and we're seeing that with, different, Amazon and Google products. People feel the differences in using the systems.
And that
influences adoption and retention. I mean, my friend in India, he buys all the IoT. He's one of those people, you probably know these people, they buy everything. And he has strong preferences. And he's like, it's just more comfortable to speak to this one. I want to speak this one more often. I will continue, it's an snowballing effect to continue using certain type of products.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, it's because we don't really think about our emotional reactions and how our preferences for certain things evolve just from these basic interactions that we have every day.
Yeah.
But when something's not working or it's going wrong, even a small thing, I use a thermos mug because I don't like drinking cold coffee. And if the seal isn't working or, it's not keeping things as hot as it should, you won't go back to the product, will you?
Absolutely not. And who is going to recommend, right? You discover, you try, you adopt, you're retained as a user, and you tell your friends about it too, right? There's the way we think about it in the zeitgeist, which ones are the good products to be using or trying out. And I don't know, I struggle to go to dinner parties. When we had dinner parties, to go and people like, oh, you work in voice, and people would tell me their stories of, it turned on in the middle of the night and now we never use it again. But really there's a lot of interest and sometimes vitriol about bad experiences. But what I think we're going to see in the next 2 to 5 years is going to be a huge transformation in this space. And so I love listening to people's encounters and the way they think about products, especially with privacy and things. It's one of the top questions I get day in and day out. Oh, you work on voice. How terrible, voice is, a dangerous kind of thing. And I don't believe it's warranted whatsoever. I think voice data is extremely rich. Talk to anyone who plays with this voice data. But as far as cybersecurity, friends of mine tell me, privacy, at least in the United States, around the world it's different, but privacy in the United States ended in the early 2000s for obvious reasons. And so any of our devices are collecting myriad of data about us. And it's ones we choose to use. We opt in for a lot of these things. Yeah,
that's so true. But I mean, it's interesting, the message that the point that you made earlier about the retention and the impression and the branding. Are those things that you really try to communicate to those managing a project when a project begins? That it's not just a conversational design project. It can have a really significant impact on your brand if something doesn't work or if something isn't quite right. And do they get that?
Well, usually, yeah. I think that's I'm often the one in the room asking about numbers and how we measure the things and talking about the impacts of things, how we're benchmarking, what numbers were before we launched the systems, what numbers will be in the months after, in the years after, how we iterate the system, how that breeds brand awareness, partnering with marketing folks. There are so many different parts of the puzzle, but I think you have to be thinking about that broader picture and the potential serious negative impacts if things go wrong.
And just before we wrap up, Joan, what advice or guidance would you, what guidance would you offer to students who are going into this new course, voice interaction design, and they want to particularly focus on conversational design? Are there any words that you'd pass on to them to help them with their work and their careers?
Words of guidance. I would recommend being flexible and creative and kind of agile. The first thing you write will not probably be the thing that's shipped, and just really thinking about being flexible and creative and trying things out. And instead of sitting on your thumbs, just starting, trying different things, collaborating, find other people to work with, join Women in Voice, obviously, and really start talking to your peers, reading this course. There are amazing blogs out there, testing different systems. I test systems all the time and get tons of inspiration from different product choices that other people are making. So I think just dive in deep.
That sounds good. And do you have any favorite podcasts or books or blogs that you read yourself that might be of interest to students?
I certainly follow the voicebot.ai work by Brett Kinsella, which is more of a website and news thing. I listened to How I Built This. I guess I'm thinking far more on the entrepreneurial side by Guy Raz, the podcast. But I wouldn't say that I necessarily follow any voice medium platforms. I more follow people and different people in the field that I deeply respect, both their technical work and as well as their leadership in our field.
Yeah, that sounds great. I really appreciate that. I'm sure the listeners will as well. Well, Joan, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Lovely to speak with you too. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm sure we'll speak again in the not too distant future.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening today. Remember, you can find all the information on how to become a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions, so be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We'll include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, we will explore different types of settings for voice tech. Guest Brielle Nikoloff will discuss use cases for voice-first interfaces. Be sure to join us then.